The wrench slipped from my greasy fingers for the third time that morning, clanging against the concrete like a church bell announcing my latest failure. I was lying under my beat-up Ford pickup, wrestling with a transmission that had seen better decades, when I heard Marta's voice drifting through the open kitchen window. "I want you tonight. He won't be back until tomorrow." I froze, my spine pressed against the cold driveway, oil dripping onto my forehead like some twisted baptism. Yes, I turned off the GPS tracking. Jack won't know where I've been. Nothing like a little betrayal to spice up a Thursday morning. I'd been married to Marta Waverly Mallory for 23 years, and apparently I'd been flying solo for the last few months of it. I slid out from under the truck, wiped my hands on an already filthy rag, and stood there in my driveway like some blue-collar statue of confusion. The morning sun felt different now, harsher somehow, casting shadows that seemed to mock my ignorance. Marta appeared in the doorway, all polished and perfect in her designer suit, clutching her phone like a lifeline to her new world. She'd been climbing the corporate ladder at Waverly & Coper's advertising for the past 5 years, ever since her sister Victoria had gotten her the interview. What started as a receptionist position had morphed into something much bigger, complete with expense accounts, company lunches, and apparently company romance. "Morning, honey," she said, not meeting my eyes. "I'll be working late again tonight. Big presentation tomorrow." I nodded, playing the part of the oblivious husband. "Sure thing. I'll probably grab dinner with Louise at the gym anyway." Louise ran the boxing gym where I'd been spending most of my evenings lately, pounding heavy bags and pretending they were my problems. She was tough as nails, fiercely loyal, and the only person in this town who still treated me like I had half a brain. Marta kissed my cheek, a quick peck that felt like a business transaction, and clicked across the driveway in her expensive heels. Her BMW purred to life, a sound that used to make me proud. Now it just reminded me how far apart we'd grown. I watched her drive away, then walked back into our house. 23 years of marriage decorated the walls in family photos and shared memories, but suddenly it all felt like evidence of a crime I hadn't realized was being committed. The kitchen still smelled like her perfume, something French and expensive that she'd started wearing about 6 months ago. Around the same time, she'd started working those late nights and weekend conferences. Around the same time, she'd stopped looking at me like I was anything more than furniture. I poured myself coffee from the pot she'd left behind and sat at our kitchen table, staring out at the neighborhood I'd helped build with my own hands. Most of these houses bore my company's signature somewhere, whether it was custom cabinetry, deck work, or full renovations. Jack Mallory Construction had a reputation in this town, and it was a good one. But reputation doesn't buy you respect in certain circles. The circles where my wife now spent her time, my phone buzzed, a text from our son Ross, away at college. "Dad, can you send some extra cash? Mom said the account's been tight lately." Tight. Right. I'd been wondering where that extra $3,000 a month had been going. Now I had a pretty good idea. I finished my coffee and headed back outside to finish fixing the truck. Physical work had always been my way of thinking through problems, and right now I had a big one. The transmission fought me for another hour before finally cooperating. As I tightened the last bolt, Mrs. Kessler from next door appeared at her fence, coffee mug in hand and curiosity written across her weathered face. "Morning, Jack. Saw Marta leave early again. She's been keeping busy hours lately." Mrs. Kessler had been our neighbor for 15 years and had elevated nosiness to an art form. Usually I found her intrusions annoying. Today, they felt like intelligence gathering. "Yeah, big things happening at her company. A lot of responsibility." "Mm-hmm." She sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "That's nice. Must be rewarding work, all those evening meetings and weekend conferences. Very dedicated." The way she said dedicated made it clear that Mrs. Kessler's radar had picked up the same signals mine had missed. I wiped my hands clean and looked at her directly. "You notice anything else, Mrs. Kessler? You've got the best view of the neighborhood from that kitchen window of yours." She smiled, the expression of someone who'd been waiting for this exact question. "Well, since you ask, I did think it was odd that she's been taking different routes home lately, coming from the Lake District instead of downtown, and that new phone she carries, the little one. Seems like a lot of technology for one person." The Lake District, where the expensive houses sat on manicured lots, where people like my wife's boss lived in glass monuments to their own success. "Thanks, Mrs. Kessler. I appreciate you looking out for the neighborhood." "Of course, dear. That's what neighbors do." I spent the rest of the afternoon in my workshop, a converted garage space where I kept my tools and did my thinking. The familiar smell of sawdust and machine oil usually calmed me down, but today my mind kept racing. 23 years, 2 kids, A mortgage we'd paid down together, sacrifice by sacrifice. Late nights when I'd held her hair back during morning sickness. Early mornings when she'd brought me coffee while I worked on weekend projects. Birthday parties, anniversaries, family vacations to places we could barely afford but somehow made work. All of it apparently worth trading for whatever she'd found in her new life. My phone rang. Louise. "You sound like garbage," she said without preamble. "What's wrong?" "Can't fool you, can I?" "Nope. Come down to the gym. Bring your gloves." Louise's gym occupied the bottom floor of an old brick building downtown, sandwiched between a diner that served the best coffee in town and a used bookstore that somehow stayed in business. The space smelled like sweat and determination, filled with heavy bags, speed bags, and the kind of honest work that left you tired but satisfied. Louise was waiting for me, arms crossed, wearing her usual uniform of tank top and worn jeans. She'd been a semi-professional fighter before opening the gym, and still moved like someone who could handle herself in any situation. "Talk," she said. So I did. I told her about the phone conversation, the GPS comment, the late nights and weekend conferences, the way Marta looked through me instead of at me, the $3,000 a month disappearing from our accounts. Louise listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When I finished, she handed me a pair of gloves. "Hit something," she said. "Then we'll figure out what comes next." I spent an hour working the heavy bag, letting each punch carry some of the anger and confusion that had been building inside me. Louise held the bag steady, absorbing the impact of my frustration. "Feel better?" she asked when I finally stopped. "A little." "Good. Now let's talk strategy. You could confront her directly, but then you'd only know what she wants to tell you. You could hire a private investigator, but that costs money and takes time. Or you could do some investigating yourself." "What kind of investigating?" Louise smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. The kind that gives you leverage instead of just answers. I drove home as the sun was setting, my mind clearer than it had been all day. Marta's BMW wasn't in the driveway, which meant she was already at her late meeting. I parked the truck and walked into our empty house. Her home office was off limits usually, but tonight felt like a night for breaking rules. I sat at her desk and opened her laptop, but it was password protected. I tried our anniversary date, the kids' birthdays, our address. Nothing worked. Then I remembered the new phone Mrs. Kessler had mentioned. I searched through Marta's usual hiding places. Her jewelry box, her dresser drawers, the pocket of her winter coat. Finally, I found it tucked inside an old purse in the back of her closet. A cheap flip phone, the kind people bought when they wanted privacy. I turned it on and scrolled through the messages. What I found there made my hands shake. Dozens of text messages between Marta and someone named Jake. Messages that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Messages that detailed meetings at expensive restaurants, weekend getaways to lakeside resorts, and plans for a future that didn't include me. The most recent message was from this afternoon. "Can't wait for tonight. Bring that wine we talked about. The good stuff." Wine. I scrolled back through the messages until I found the reference. A $500 bottle of something French, purchased for a celebration at Jake's lakeside house. I knew that house. Everyone in town knew it. Jake Turnbull, senior partner at Waverly & Co., had built it 3 years ago as a monument to his success. Glass and steel jutting out over the water like some modern-day castle. I put the phone back where I'd found it and sat in my living room, staring at family photos and trying to decide what kind of man I wanted to be. The old Jack would have confronted Marta directly, demanded explanations, maybe even begged her to reconsider. The old Jack would have accepted whatever story she gave him and tried to work things out. But the old Jack had been played for a fool. The new Jack was going to be smarter. I grabbed my keys and headed for the Lake District. If Marta wanted to play games, she was about to learn that her husband had been underestimated. The drive to Jake's house took 20 minutes through increasingly expensive neighborhoods. The houses grew larger and more ostentatious with each mile, until I reached the lakeside community where people like Jake Turnbull lived in glass houses and threw stones at everyone else's marriages. Jake's place sat on 2 acres of manicured lawn, all angles and windows designed to impress visitors and intimidate competitors. I parked a quarter-mile away and walked through the woods that bordered his property. The house was lit up like a Christmas display, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see everything. Marta sat in Jake's hot tub, champagne flute in hand, laughing at something he'd said. Her clothes were scattered across the deck like discarded promises. Jake, a man I'd met exactly once at a company party, was playing the part of the successful seducer, all confidence and entitlement. I watched them for 10 minutes, taking mental photographs of every detail. the expensive bottle of wine sitting on the deck table. Jake's Mercedes parked in the circular driveway. The security camera mounted on the corner of the house, currently pointed toward the water instead of the driveway. Then I walked back to Jake's car. I'd brought my work knife, the one I used for cutting rope and opening packages. The blade was sharp enough to slice through tire rubber like butter. I knelt beside his Mercedes and went to work. 4 tires, each one receiving a neat puncture that would deflate slowly over the next few hours. By the time Jake discovered the damage, I'd be long gone, but I wasn't finished. I opened my truck's glove compartment and pulled out something I'd grabbed from my workshop on impulse, a rubber rat, left over from a Halloween prank the kids had played years ago. I placed it on Jake's dashboard, positioned so he'd see it first thing when he got in the car. A message. Nothing threatening, just a reminder that someone was watching. I was walking back toward the woods when I heard the soft whir of machinery. The security camera was rotating, its lens sweeping across the driveway in a slow arc. I froze, calculating angles and timing. Had it caught me? The camera completed its rotation and pointed back toward the water, but I couldn't be sure what it had recorded. No matter. If Jake wanted to call the police about vandalism, he'd have to explain why someone might want to vandalize his car. That conversation would get interesting quickly. I drove home feeling better than I had in months. Marta's BMW was still missing from our driveway, which meant she was still at Jake's place, probably planning their next romantic getaway. Let them plan. I had plans of my own now. I spent the rest of the evening in my workshop, making a list of everything I knew and everything I needed to find out. Names, dates, places, financial records. If Marta and Jake thought they were playing a game, they were about to discover that games had rules, and rules could be changed. My phone buzzed around midnight. A text from Marta. "Working very late. Don't wait up." I texted back. "No problem. Sleep well." But I knew she wouldn't be sleeping much tonight. Not after Jake discovered what had happened to his car. I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, already planning tomorrow's moves. The game was just beginning, and I intended to win. The next morning brought rain and revelation in equal measure. I was drinking coffee and reading the newspaper when Marta stumbled through the front door, looking like she'd spent the night wrestling with her conscience and losing. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and her designer dress wrinkled beyond repair. She clutched her purse like it contained the secrets of the universe, which, given what I now knew, it probably did. "Rough night at the office?" I asked without looking up from the sports section. "You could say that." She headed straight for the stairs. "I'm going to shower and change. Big day ahead." "I bet." She paused on the bottom step, something in my tone making her look back. "Is everything all right, Jack?" I folded the newspaper and looked at her directly. 23 years of marriage had taught me to read her expressions, and right now she looked guilty, exhausted, and slightly afraid. "Everything's fine, honey. Just wondering how the presentation went." "Oh, that. It went well, very well. Jake was impressed." "Jake." She'd used his first name without thinking, a slip that confirmed what I already knew. "That's great. I'm happy your hard work is paying off." She nodded and hurried upstairs, leaving behind the lingering scent of expensive cologne that definitely wasn't mine. I finished my coffee and headed to work, but my mind wasn't on construction projects. I was thinking about strategy, about timing, about the difference between revenge and justice. My first stop was the office of Bradley and Associates, a small private investigation firm downtown. Tom Bradley had been a cop for 20 years before going private, and he owed me a favor from when I'd renovated his kitchen at cost. "Jack Mallory," he said, standing up from behind a desk covered in case files. "What brings you to my humble establishment?" "I need information, Tom. The kind that requires professional expertise?" Tom was a big man with careful eyes and the kind of patience that came from years of police work. He listened while I explained the situation, occasionally asking questions or making notes. "Adultery cases are bread and butter for guys like me," he said when I finished, "but it sounds like you already have most of the evidence you need. What exactly are you looking for?" "Background, financial records, business relationships. I want to know everything about Jake Turnbull and his connection to my wife's company." "That kind of investigation takes time and costs money." I pulled out my checkbook. "How much time and how much money?" 2 weeks, $1,500, and I'll give you enough information to bury both of them professionally." "Deal." Tom and I shook hands, and I left his office feeling like I'd just hired a general for a war I was finally ready to fight. My next stop was Louise's gym. I found her training a teenager who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, patiently correcting his form and encouraging him to keep his guard up. "Life lessons," she said when the kid left. "Boxing teaches you how to take a punch and keep moving forward." "Speaking of taking punches, I could use some advice." I told her about my evening reconnaissance mission and my meeting with Tom Bradley. Louise listened with the kind of attention she usually reserved for studying her opponents before a fight. "You're thinking like a strategist now, instead of a victim," she said. "That's good, but you need to be careful not to let anger make you stupid." "What do you mean?" "I mean that revenge is a dish best served with a clear head and clean hands. You want to destroy them, but you don't want to destroy yourself in the process." She was right, of course. Louise had a way of cutting through emotional fog and getting to the heart of things. "So what do you suggest?" "Patience, preparation, and maybe a little bit of theater when the time comes." Theater. I liked the sound of that. I spent the rest of the day working on a kitchen renovation for the Hendersons, a retired couple who'd hired me to update their 1970s-era disaster. Physical work helped me think, and by the time I finished installing their new cabinets, I had the beginnings of a plan. The plan started with a phone call to Waverly & Co. Show's main number. "I'd like to speak with someone about making a large advertising purchase," I told the receptionist. "Certainly, sir. Can I get your name and company information?" "Jack Mallory, Mallory Construction. We're looking at a major expansion, and we need a firm that can handle a significant campaign." 5 minutes later, I was transferred to Dave Millant, the company's CEO. Dave was old money, the kind of guy who'd inherited his position and spent most of his time playing golf with other inherited positions. "Mr. Mallory, I understand you're interested in our services." "That's right. We're talking about a 6-figure campaign, maybe more if the initial results are good." I could practically hear Dave salivating through the phone. "Excellent. I'd love to set up a meeting. Are you available for lunch tomorrow? We could discuss your needs and show you some of our recent work." "Tomorrow works perfectly. Should I bring my wife? She has some experience with advertising, and I value her opinion." "Of course. The more the merrier. Do you know the Lakeside Club?" I knew it. Expensive, exclusive, the kind of place where people like Dave Millant went to remind themselves how important they were. "I'll see you there at noon." "Wonderful. Oh, and Mr. Mallory, you mentioned your wife has advertising experience. Where did she work?" "Actually, she works for you. Marta Waverly Mallory." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for me to count my heartbeats. "I see. Well, that's convenient. I'll make sure Jake Turnbull joins us for lunch. He's been working closely with Marta on several projects." "Perfect. I'm looking forward to meeting him." I hung up and smiled for the first time in weeks. Sometimes the best traps were the ones people walked into voluntarily. That evening, Marta came home at a reasonable hour, probably trying to establish an alibi of normalcy. She seemed nervous, checking her phones frequently and jumping every time one of them buzzed. "How was your day?" she asked over dinner, making an effort at conversation we hadn't shared in months. "Productive. I'm meeting with your boss tomorrow about a potential advertising contract." She nearly choked on her wine. "Your what?" "Business has been good, and I'm thinking about expanding. Dave Millant suggested lunch at the Lakeside Club. He's bringing Jake Turnbull along." Marta's face went through several color changes before settling on pale green. "Jack, I don't think that's a good idea. I mean, mixing business with personal relationships can get complicated." "Don't worry, honey. I'm sure Jake and I will get along just fine." She spent the rest of dinner pushing food around her plate and making excuses to check her phone. After we finished eating, she disappeared into her office for an hour, probably warning Jake about tomorrow's lunch. Let her warn him. I wanted Jake to know what was coming. I went to bed early and slept better than I had in weeks. Tomorrow was going to be interesting. The Lakeside Club occupied a restored mansion overlooking the water, all white columns and old money pretensions. I arrived exactly on time, wearing my best suit and carrying a briefcase full of construction company financial records that painted a picture of impressive growth and expansion potential. Dave Millant was waiting in the lobby, a soft man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd never worked a day of physical labor in his life. Beside him stood Jake Turnbull, and I had to admit that Marta had good taste in men, if not in moral choices. Jake was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. He was also nervous, which told me that Marta had indeed warned him about today's meeting. "Mr. Mallory," Dave said, extending a hand. "So good to meet you. This is Jake Turnbull, one of our senior partners." Jake's handshake was firm, but his eyes were calculating, trying to figure out how much I knew and how dangerous I might be. "Pleasure to meet you, Jake. I've heard so much about you from Marta." "All good things, I hope." "Oh, absolutely. She speaks very highly of your collaboration." We were seated at a corner table with a view of the lake, and Dave immediately launched into a presentation about Waverly & Co.'s capabilities and success stories. I listened politely while studying Jake, who seemed to be having trouble concentrating on the conversation. "Your wife is a valuable member of our team," Jake said during a lull in Dave's monologue. "Very dedicated, very professional. She certainly puts in long hours, all those evening meetings and weekend conferences." "The advertising business is demanding," Jake replied. "Success requires sacrifice." "I'm sure it does. Marta's been making a lot of sacrifices lately." The waiter appeared to take our orders, giving Jake a moment to compose himself. When he looked back at me, there was something harder in his expression. "Mr. Mallory, I get the feeling this lunch isn't entirely about advertising." "What makes you say that?" "Call it professional intuition." I smiled and leaned back in my chair. "You're right, Jake. This lunch is about relationships. Business relationships, professional relationships, personal relationships, the way they intersect and influence each other." Dave looked confused, but Jake's face had gone pale. "I'm not sure I follow." "Let me be more direct. My wife has been having an affair, Jake, with someone at your company, someone who thinks he can take what belongs to me without consequences." The silence at our table was deafening. Dave's mouth fell open, and Jake's hand tightened around his water glass. "Mr. Mallory," Dave stammered, "I had no idea." "Of course you didn't, Dave, but Jake did. Didn't you, Jake?" Jake straightened in his chair, and for a moment I thought he might try to bluff his way out of the situation. "She chose better," he said finally, his voice quiet but defiant. There it was, the moment I'd been building toward. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a number I'd programmed that morning. "So did your investors," I said, and pressed call. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Margaret Chen. Margaret was the majority shareholder in Waverly & Co., a shrewd businesswoman who'd made her fortune in real estate before diversifying into other investments. I'd done construction work for her 5 years ago, and we'd stayed in touch. "Margaret, it's Jack Mallory. We need to talk about your investment in Waverly & Co." Jake was staring at me now, his confidence evaporating. "What about it, Jack?" "I'm sitting here with Dave Millant and Jake Turnbull, and I think you should know that Jake has been having an affair with one of his subordinates, a woman named Marta Mallory." The silence on the other end of the line was brief but telling. "That's a serious accusation, Jack. It's also a serious liability issue. Harassment claims, hostile work environment, potential lawsuits. The kind of thing that could damage the company's reputation and your investment." "I see. Can you prove these allegations?" "Text messages, photographs, financial records showing company money being used for personal entertainment. Yes, Margaret, I can prove it." Jake's phone started ringing. He looked at the caller ID, and his face went white. "You might want to answer that, Jake," I said. "I think it's important." Jake answered his phone with a shaking hand. "Hello, Margaret." I couldn't hear her side of the conversation, but I could see its effect on Jake's face. His confident smirk disappeared, replaced by something that looked like panic. "Yes, I understand. Emergency board meeting. This afternoon? Yes, I'll be there." He hung up and looked at me with something approaching respect. "You planned this." "I planned this." Dave was looking back and forth between us like a spectator at a tennis match. "What's happening? Someone explain what's happening." "What's happening, Dave, is that your company is about to have a very serious conversation about professional conduct and liability management." Jake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This isn't over, Mallory." "You're right, Jake. It's just getting started." He left without another word, probably rushing back to the office to prepare for what was going to be a very unpleasant afternoon. Dave stayed for another few minutes, asking questions I deflected with polite non-answers. Finally, he excused himself, muttering about damage control and crisis management. I finished my lunch alone, watching boats drift across the lake and thinking about the phone call Marta was probably receiving right about now. My phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "Well played. Louise." Somehow she'd heard about the lunch already. News traveled fast in a town this size. I paid the check and drove home, where I found Marta's BMW in the driveway and Marta herself pacing in our living room like a caged animal. "What have you done?" she demanded as soon as I walked through the door. "I had lunch with your boss and your boyfriend. Pleasant conversation." "Jake called me. He said you ambushed them with accusations and threats." "I prefer to think of it as information sharing." She stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. "I don't know who you are anymore." "I'm the same person I've always been, Marta. The difference is that now I know who you are." She sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way." "How was it supposed to happen? You were going to leave me for Jake eventually, right? Take half of everything I've built and start fresh with your upgrade. It's not about money, Jack. Then what is it about? She looked at me with something that might have been pity. It's about feeling alive again. It's about being with someone who sees me as more than just a fixture in his life. Her words stung because they contained just enough truth to hurt. So you decided to destroy our marriage instead of trying to fix it. I tried to fix it. For years I tried. But you were always working, always building something, always focused on the next project. When was the last time you really looked at me, Jack? When was the last time you made me feel like I mattered? I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the words wouldn't come. Because maybe she was right. Maybe I had taken her for granted. Maybe I had focused so much on providing for our family that I'd forgotten to actually be part of it. But that didn't excuse what she'd done. You could have talked to me, Marta. You could have told me how you felt instead of running to Jake. Would you have listened? The question hung between us like a challenge I wasn't sure I could meet. My phone rang, interrupting the moment. Tom Bradley. Jack, I've got some preliminary information you're going to want to hear. Can it wait? Not really. Jake Turnbull just got fired, and your wife is being called into HR tomorrow morning. Whatever you did today, it worked. I looked at Marta, who was watching me with growing alarm. Thanks, Tom. We'll talk later. I hung up and turned back to my wife. Jake's been terminated. You're meeting with HR tomorrow. She closed her eyes and took a shuddering breath. What do you want from me, Jack? I want you to understand that actions have consequences. I want you to realize that the life you thought you were trading up to just disappeared. And then what? Do we try to fix this? Do we start over? I looked around our living room, at the photos and memories and shared history that had once meant everything to me. I don't know, Marta. I honestly don't know. But I knew one thing for certain. The game was far from over. The HR meeting lasted exactly 17 minutes. I know because I was sitting in the parking lot of Waverly & Co., watching the clock on my dashboard and wondering if my wife's career was ending in real time. Marta emerged from the building looking like she'd aged a decade in less than 20 minutes. Her shoulders were slumped, her confident stride replaced by the uncertain shuffle of someone who'd just discovered that consequences were real. She didn't see me parked across the street. She climbed into her BMW, sat there for several minutes with her hands on the steering wheel, then drove away in the direction of her sister Victoria's house. Victoria. I'd almost forgotten about Marta's sister and all of this drama, but now I was remembering things that should have seemed suspicious months ago. Late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room, weekend shopping trips that never seemed to involve any actual purchases, Victoria's sudden interest in Marta's work schedule and social calendar. I called Tom Bradley. Jack, I was just about to call you. I've got that information you wanted. Meet me at Murphy's Diner in 20 minutes. Murphy's was the kind of place where construction workers grabbed coffee at 5 in the morning and retirees argued about politics over afternoon pie. The booths were cracked vinyl, the coffee was strong, and nobody paid attention to conversations that weren't their business. Tom was waiting in a corner booth with a manila folder and a grim expression. Jake Turnbull, he said without preamble, is a piece of work. Married for 18 years, 2 kids in private school, big house on the lake that's mortgaged to the hilt. Financial problems? Worse than that. He's been using company funds for personal expenses, expensive dinners, weekend getaways, jewelry purchases, all of it disguised as client entertainment or business development. Tom opened the folder and spread photographs across the table. Jake and Marta at expensive restaurants, Jake and Marta at a lakeside resort, Jake and Marta shopping for jewelry at stores that charge more for a bracelet than most people made in a month. How much are we talking about? Conservative estimate, $50,000 over the past 8 months, maybe more. I studied the photographs, feeling a mixture of anger and something that might have been relief. At least now I knew where our missing money had gone. What about Marta's involvement? That's where it gets interesting. She knew about the company funds, but she wasn't directly involved in the theft. However, she did help cover it up by filing false expense reports and providing alibis for Jake's absences. Conspiracy. At minimum. Possibly accessory to embezzlement, depending on how aggressive the prosecutor wants to be. Tom pulled out another set of photographs, these showing Victoria meeting with Jake at a coffee shop downtown. Your sister-in-law has been busy too. Turns out she's got gambling debts, serious ones. She owes money to some people who don't accept late payments gracefully. How serious? $25,000 to a casino in Atlantic City, another $15,000 to some local poker games that aren't exactly legal. She's been feeding information to Jake about your wife's schedule, your work habits, even your financial situation. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture that was somehow worse than simple adultery. Victoria was helping them plan their exit strategy. That's my read on it. Jake was going to leave his wife, Marta was going to leave you, and Victoria was going to get a finder's fee for facilitating the whole thing. I leaned back in the booth, processing the scope of the betrayal. It wasn't just my wife cheating on me, it was a coordinated effort involving multiple people, all of whom had decided that I was expendable. Tom, I need you to do something else for me. Name it. I want copies of everything. Financial records, photographs, phone records, everything. And I want you to prepare a complete report for Margaret Chen and the board of directors at Waverly & Co. You want to bury them completely. I want to make sure they understand that their actions have consequences. Tom nodded and gathered up the photographs. It'll take me a few days to put together a comprehensive package. What are you going to do in the meantime? I'm going to have a conversation with Victoria. Victoria lived in a townhouse development on the other side of town, the kind of place that looked impressive from the street but cut corners everywhere the builders thought they could get away with it. I'd actually done some work in the development years ago, before I realized that the developer was more interested in profit margins than quality construction. I knocked on Victoria's door at 6 o'clock that evening, just as she was getting home from her job at a downtown boutique. She answered wearing the kind of forced smile that people used when they were expecting bad news. Jack, what a surprise. Is everything okay? That depends on your definition of okay, Victoria. Can I come in? She hesitated, probably calculating whether it was safer to have this conversation in private or on her front porch where the neighbors might overhear. Of course, come in. Victoria's living room was decorated in what I'd call desperate elegance. Expensive furniture that was probably financed, artwork that looked impressive until you noticed it was mass-produced, and the kind of accessories that people bought when they wanted to look successful but couldn't afford to actually be successful. Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Water? I'm fine, Victoria. I just want to talk. She perched on the edge of her sofa like she was ready to run if necessary. What did you want to talk about? Let's start with your gambling problem. Victoria's carefully composed expression cracked like a dropped plate. I don't know what you mean. 25,000 to Atlantic City, another 15 to local games, plus interest, penalties, and the kind of pressure that comes from people who don't like to be kept waiting. She stared at me for a long moment, probably trying to figure out how I'd learned about her debts. How did you... It doesn't matter how I know, Victoria. What matters is what you've been doing to help pay those debts. I haven't done anything wrong. You've been spying on me and Marta, feeding information to Jake Turnbull, helping them coordinate their affair and plan their exit strategy. Victoria's composure finally collapsed completely. She buried her face in her hands and started crying, the kind of desperate sobs that came from months of accumulated stress and fear. You don't understand, she said between sobs. They were going to hurt me, Jack. The people I owe money to, they don't make empty threats. So you decided to help destroy my marriage instead. It wasn't supposed to hurt you. Jake said he was going to take care of Marta, that she'd be happier with him. He said you'd be better off without her anyway. And what did Jake offer you for this service? Victoria wiped her eyes with a tissue and looked at me with something that might have been shame. $10,000, enough to get the worst creditors off my back. $10,000 to betray your own sister's husband. I was desperate, Jack. You don't know what it's like to have people calling you at all hours, threatening to hurt you if you don't pay. I felt a moment of something that might have been pity for Victoria, but it passed quickly. Where's Marta now? She's upstairs in my guest room. She's been here since this morning, crying and trying to figure out what to do next. Tell her I want to talk to her. Jack, I don't think... Tell her, Victoria. Victoria climbed the stairs slowly, like she was walking to her own execution. I heard muffled voices from upstairs, then footsteps on the stairs. Marta appeared in the living room doorway looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red from crying, her hair was disheveled, and she was wearing the same clothes she'd had on that morning. Hello, Marta. Jack? She sat down across from me, maintaining careful distance. I suppose you know everything now. I know about Jake's embezzlement. I know about Victoria's gambling debts. I know about the plan to leave me for your upgrade boyfriend. It wasn't about upgrading, Jack. Then what was it about? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a conspiracy to steal my wife and my money. Marta was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. It was about feeling wanted again. Jake made me feel important, valued, like I mattered. So you decided to throw away 23 years of marriage. Those 23 years were already over, Jack. We'd been living like strangers for months, maybe years. She wasn't wrong, but that didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. What happens now, Marta? I don't know. Jake's been fired. I'm probably going to be fired, and apparently we're both facing potential criminal charges. The criminal charges depend on whether Waverly and Coers decides to prosecute. That decision depends on how much damage they think you and Jake have done to their reputation. Are you going to try to influence that decision? I looked at my wife, really looked at her, and tried to find some remnant of the woman I'd fallen in love with 25 years ago. I'm going to do what's best for me and our kids, Marta. For the first time in a long time, I'm going to put my own interests first. What does that mean? It means you're going to find out what consequences feel like. I stood up to leave, but Marta's voice stopped me. Jack, wait, is there any chance? Is there any possibility that we could work this out? Go to counseling, try to rebuild? I turned back to look at her, this woman who'd shared my bed and my dreams and my hopes for the future. You made your choice, Marta. You chose Jake, you chose deception, you chose to destroy what we had instead of trying to fix it. Now you get to live with that choice. But what if Jake and I are over? What if that whole thing was a mistake? Then you'll have to figure out how to live with your mistakes. Just like I'm figuring out how to live with mine. I left Victoria's townhouse and drove home to our empty house, where I sat in my workshop and tried to decide what kind of man I wanted to be when this was all over. My phone rang around 9 o'clock. Louise. How are you holding up? I've been better, I've also been worse. Want some company? I've got a bottle of whiskey and a willingness to listen. Come on over. Louise arrived 20 minutes later with a bottle of good Irish whiskey and the kind of practical wisdom that came from years of watching people fight battles they couldn't win. So what's the plan? She asked after I'd filled her in on the day's revelations. I'm not sure there is a plan anymore. Jake's finished, Marta's probably finished, Victoria's broke and desperate. Maybe that's enough. Is it enough for you? I thought about that question while I poured 2 glasses of whiskey. I don't know. 6 months ago, I would have said that all I wanted was my wife back and my marriage fixed. Now I'm not sure I want either of those things. What do you want? I want to stop feeling like a fool. I want to stop being the guy that people think they can walk all over without consequences. Louise raised her glass. Then here's to consequences. To consequences. We drank, and I started planning the final act of this drama that had taken over my life. Because Victoria was right about one thing. This wasn't over yet. 3 days later, Tom Bradley called with news that changed everything. Jack, you need to hear this. Jake Turnbull didn't just get fired. He's been arrested. I was in my workshop, pretending to organize tools while actually planning my next move. The arrest news stopped me cold. Arrested for what? Embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Apparently, Margaret Chen decided to make an example out of him. The FBI raided his house this morning and seized financial records going back 2 years. What about Marta? No arrest yet, but she's been named as a co-conspirator. Her lawyer advised her to leave town until things cool down. Leave town. That explained why I hadn't seen her BMW in our driveway for the past 2 days. Any idea where she went? Actually, yes. That's the interesting part. She and Victoria are holed up at Jake's lake house. Apparently, Jake gave Victoria the keys before he was arrested, told her to keep an eye on things until his legal situation gets resolved. The lake house. The same place where I'd watched my wife betray our marriage, now serving as her refuge from the consequences of that betrayal. Tom, I need you to do something for me. What kind of something? I need detailed information about that lake house. Security systems, access points, utility shutoffs. Everything. Jack, whatever you're planning. I'm not planning anything violent, Tom. I just want to have a conversation with my wife and her sister. A private conversation. Tom was quiet for a moment, probably weighing his professional obligations against his personal loyalty. Give me a few hours. I spent those hours thinking about endings, about the difference between justice and revenge, about the kind of man I wanted to be when this was all over. Louise found me there around sunset, sitting in my workshop with a glass of whiskey and a head full of dark thoughts. You look like someone planning something stupid, she said. Maybe I am. Want to talk about it? I told her about Jake's arrest, about Marta and Victoria hiding out at the lake house, about the conversation I intended to have with them. And after this conversation, then what? Then it's over. One way or another, it's over. Louise studied my face in the dim light of the workshop. You sure about that? Because once you cross certain lines, Jack, you can't uncross them. I crossed a line the day I found out my wife was cheating on me. Everything since then has just been deciding which direction to go. And which direction is that? Forward, away from the man who let people walk all over him. Louise nodded slowly. Okay, but you're not going alone. Louise, nope, non-negotiable. If you're doing this, I'm backup. I wanted to argue, but the truth was that I'd feel better having Louise there. She had a way of keeping situations from spiraling out of control. Tom called back around 9 o'clock with the information I'd requested. The lake house had a basic security system, motion sensors around the perimeter, and cameras covering the main approaches. But there was a service road that ran along the back of the property used by maintenance crews and landscapers. The power comes in through a junction box on the north side of the house, Tom said. Easy to access if you know what you're looking for. I know what I'm looking for. Jack, be careful. Jake might be in jail, but that doesn't mean the house is empty. And if Marta and Victoria are as desperate as you say, they might not react well to surprises. I'm not planning to surprise them, Tom. I'm planning to announce myself. Louise and I drove out to the Lake District around 11 o'clock when the expensive neighborhood was settling into its nightly routine of quiet desperation and hidden secrets. Jake's lake house sat dark against the water, only a few windows showing light. We parked on the service road and walked through the woods that bordered the property. The motion sensors were positioned to cover the main driveway and the lakefront approach, but they missed the narrow path that maintenance crews use to access the utility areas. I found the power junction box exactly where Tom had said it would be. A few minutes with my electrician's tools, and the house went dark. That should get their attention, Louise whispered. We waited in the woods, watching the house. After a few minutes, flashlight beams appeared in the windows, moving from room to room as the occupants tried to figure out what had happened. Then the front door opened, and Victoria appeared with a flashlight, probably heading for the circuit breaker panel. Now, I said. Louise and I emerged from the woods and walked across the lawn toward the house. Victoria saw us coming and froze like a deer in headlights. Hello, Victoria, I called out. Having power problems? She turned and ran back into the house, slamming the door behind her. I heard her shouting something to Marta, probably warning her that I'd found them. I walked up to the front door and knocked politely. Marta, it's Jack. I think we need to talk. No answer. I know you're in there, Marta. Victoria's car is in the driveway, and I can see your flashlight moving around. Still no answer. Okay, we'll do this the hard way. I pulled out my phone and called the local police. I'd like to report a break-in at 47 Lakeshore Drive. 2 women have illegally entered the property and are refusing to leave. That got their attention. The front door opened, and Marta appeared, her face pale in the glow of her flashlight. Jack, don't call the police, please. I ended the call without completing it. Are you ready to talk now? Come in. The lake house was even more impressive inside than it had appeared from the outside. Expensive furniture, original artwork, floor-to-ceiling windows that normally offered spectacular views of the water. Tonight, with the power out, it felt like a mausoleum. Marta and Victoria sat on opposite ends of a leather sofa, their flashlights creating a circle of light in the darkness. They looked like refugees from their own bad decisions. Louise positioned herself near the door, far enough away to give us privacy but close enough to intervene if things got out of hand. So, I said, settling into a chair across from my wife and her sister. This is where you've been hiding. We're not hiding, Marta said. We're trying to figure out what to do next. What's to figure out? Jake's in jail, you're facing criminal charges, and Victoria's gambling debts are still waiting to be paid. Victoria flinched at the mention of her debts. The people I owe money to don't care about Jake's legal problems, she said. They want their money, and they want it soon. How soon? By the end of the week, or they're going to start getting creative about collection methods. I looked around the expensive lake house, calculating the value of everything I could see. Seems like you're sitting in the middle of a solution. This place has to be worth $500,000, easy. It's not our house to sell, Marta said. Jake gave Victoria the keys. He told her to keep an eye on things. Sounds like he gave her permission to handle his affairs while he's indisposed. You're talking about theft. I'm talking about survival. Victoria needs money, Jake has assets, and Jake is going to be in prison for the next few years. Simple mathematics. Victoria was staring at me like I'd just suggested robbing a bank. I can't steal Jake's house. You can't steal what's already been given to you. Jake trusted you with access to his property. What you do with that trust is up to you. Marta leaned forward in her chair. What are you really doing here, Jack? What do you want from us? I want you to understand something, Marta. I want you to understand that the life you thought you were trading up to was always an illusion. What do you mean? Jake was never going to leave his wife for you. He was never going to give up his comfortable life for a relationship with his subordinate. He was using you, Marta, the same way he was using Victoria. That's not true? Isn't it? Where is Jake now? Is he here, protecting you from the consequences of your choices? Is he calling lawyers, arranging bail, making sure you're safe? Marta was quiet, probably realizing that Jake hadn't contacted her since his arrest. He's protecting himself, Marta, just like he always was. You were convenient when things were good, but now that things are bad, you're expendable. You don't know what you're talking about. I know that Jake embezzled $50,000 and let you help cover it up. I know that he convinced Victoria to spy on me in exchange for money he never intended to pay. I know that he made you promises he never intended to keep. I stood up and walked to the windows that looked out over the dark lake. But mostly, I know that you threw away 23 years of marriage for a fantasy that was never real. So what happens now? Marta asked. Do you want me to apologize? Do you want me to beg for forgiveness? I turned back to look at her, this woman who'd shared my life for more than 2 decades. I want you to understand that choices have consequences. You chose Jake, you chose deception, you chose to destroy our marriage. Now you get to live with those choices. And what about you, Jack? What are you choosing? I'm choosing to move forward, without you. The words hung in the air between us, final and irreversible. Victoria started crying again, the kind of hopeless sobs that came from realizing that all your options were bad ones. What am I supposed to do? She asked. The people I owe money to aren't going to wait much longer. I looked around the expensive lake house one more time, then pulled out my phone and showed Victoria a number I'd programmed earlier. Call this number. It's a real estate agent who specializes in quick sales. Tell her you're representing Jake Turnbull and you need to liquidate some assets to cover legal expenses. I can't do that. You can, and you should. Jake used you, Victoria. He promised you money he never intended to pay, and now he's left you to deal with the consequences of helping him destroy my marriage. But what if he gets out of jail? What if he comes after me? Jake's going to be in prison for a long time, Victoria, and when he gets out, he's going to have bigger problems than one missing lake house. I walked toward the door where Louise was waiting. Jack, Marta called after me, is this really how it ends? With you walking away and leaving us here? I stopped and looked back at her one last time. You ended it, Marta. I'm just acknowledging reality. Louise and I left the lake house and walked back through the woods to our car. Behind us, the expensive house sat dark against the water, sheltering 2 women who were finally beginning to understand the price of their choices. Feel better? Louise asked as we drove away. I feel finished, I said, and right now, that's enough. 2 weeks later, I was reading the morning paper when I saw the headline, Local Advertising Executive Sentenced to 5 years for Embezzlement. Jake Turnbull's mugshot stared back at me from the front page, looking nothing like the confident man who'd stolen my wife and tried to steal my dignity. The article detailed his crimes, his guilty plea, and his complete cooperation with federal investigators. There was no mention of Marta. I was still processing this information when my phone rang. Tom Bradley. Jack, you're going to want to hear this. The prosecutor's office just announced that they're not pursuing charges against your wife. Why not? Insufficient evidence of criminal intent. Apparently Marta's lawyer convinced them that she was manipulated by Jake, that she didn't understand the full scope of his embezzlement scheme. I wasn't sure how I felt about this news. Part of me wanted Marta to face the same consequences that Jake was facing, but another part of me was relieved that the mother of my children wouldn't be going to prison. What about Victoria? Interesting story there. She sold Jake's lake house 3 days after you visited them, got asking price, paid off her gambling debts, and disappeared. Disappeared? Left town. Nobody knows where she went, but she's not answering her phone and her apartment is empty. Victoria had taken my advice and chosen survival over loyalty. I couldn't say I blamed her. And Marta. Still in town, as far as I know. Word is she's been blacklisted from the advertising industry, but she hasn't been arrested. After I hung up with Tom, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and thinking about endings. Jake was in prison, Victoria had vanished, and Marta was somewhere in town trying to figure out how to rebuild a life that had been shattered by her own choices. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it just felt like the end of something that had once been important. My phone buzzed. A text from Ross, our son. Dad, can we talk? I'm driving down from college this afternoon. Ross arrived around 3 o'clock. Looking older than his 22 years and carrying the weight of family drama that no college student should have to bear. Dad, I need to know what really happened between you and Mom. We sat in my workshop, surrounded by tools and half-finished projects, and I told him everything. The affair, the embezzlement, the conspiracy, the confrontation at the lake house. Ross listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. "So it's really over," he said when I finished. "You and Mom, I mean." "It's been over for a while, son. We just hadn't admitted it yet." "What about forgiveness? What about trying to work things out?" "Some things can't be worked out, Ross. Some betrayals are too deep to forgive." Ross was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "I talked to Mom yesterday. She wants to see you." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I'd ask." I considered this. Part of me was curious about what Marta might want to say, but another part of me knew that some conversations were pointless. "Where is she staying?" "At the Riverside Motel, out on Highway 9, room 127. The Riverside Motel was the kind of place where people stayed when they'd run out of better options. Weekly rates, thin walls, and the lingering smell of other people's desperation. I found Marta's room just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me of better times. I knocked on the door and waited. Marta opened the door looking like a shadow of her former self. Gone were the expensive clothes and perfect makeup. She was wearing jeans and a sweater I recognized from years ago, and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. "Thank you for coming," she said. The motel room was small and depressing, furnished with the kind of furniture that was designed to be functional rather than comfortable. Marta had tried to make it livable with a few personal items, but it still felt like a place where hope went to fade away. "How are you doing?" I asked. "I've been better. I've also been worse." She gestured toward the room's single chair, and I sat down while she perched on the edge of the bed. "I wanted to apologize, Jack, for everything. For the affair, for the lies, for destroying our marriage." "Okay. That's it? Just okay?" "What do you want me to say, Marta? That I forgive you? That I understand why you did what you did? I want you to say something. Anything. I want you to react like you still care." I looked at this woman who'd been the center of my world for more than 2 decades and tried to find some remnant of the feelings I'd once had for her. "I cared for 23 years, Marta. I cared when you were building your career and I was supporting our family. I cared when you started working late and I was eating dinner alone. I cared when you started pulling away and I was trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. I know, and I'm sorry. But I stopped caring the day I found out about Jake. Not because I wanted to stop, but because caring was destroying me." Marta started crying, the kind of quiet tears that came from accepting painful truths. "Is there any chance for us, Jack? Any possibility of starting over?" "Starting over as what? We're not the same people we were when we got married. We're not even the same people we were 6 months ago. But we could try. We could go to counseling, work on our problems." "Our problems weren't communication issues, Marta. Our problem was that you decided our marriage wasn't worth fighting for. I made a mistake. You made a choice. A series of choices. Over months of planning and deception. That wasn't a mistake. That was a decision to prioritize your own happiness over our family." Marta wiped her eyes with a tissue and looked at me with something that might have been hope. "What if I could prove that I've changed? What if I could show you that I understand what I lost?" "How would you do that?" "I don't know, but I'd try. I'd do whatever it takes." I stood up to leave, but stopped at the door. "Marta, do you remember our wedding day? Do you remember the promises we made?" "Of course I do. I kept those promises for 23 years, through good times and bad times, through sickness and health, through richer and poorer. I kept them even when keeping them was hard, even when I felt unappreciated, even when I wondered if you still loved me. I know, Jack. I know you were a good husband." "But you didn't keep your promises, Marta. When things got difficult, when you felt unappreciated, when you wondered if I still loved you, you looked for someone else to make you feel better. I was wrong. Yes, you were. And now we both have to live with the consequences of that choice." I opened the door and stepped into the parking lot of the Riverside Motel, where people stayed when they'd run out of better options. "Jack," Marta called after me. "What happens now?" I turned back to look at her one last time, framed in the doorway of her temporary refuge. "Now you figure out how to build a new life, just like I'm doing." "Will you ever be able to forgive me?" "Maybe someday, Marta. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean going back." I drove home through the gathering darkness, past the houses I'd helped build and the neighborhoods where I'd established my reputation. Everything looked the same, but something fundamental had changed. When I got home, I found Louise sitting on my front porch with 2 cups of coffee and a patient expression. "How did it go?" she asked. "It went exactly how it needed to go." "And how do you feel?" I thought about that question while I unlocked my front door and invited Louise inside. I feel like I'm ready to figure out what comes next. Any ideas about what that might be? A few. I'm thinking about expanding the business, maybe taking on some bigger projects. Ross graduates next year, and Amelia's got 2 more years of college. After that, I'll have more freedom to try new things. What kind of new things? I don't know yet, but for the first time in months, I'm looking forward to finding out. Louise raised her coffee cup. Here's to new things. To new things. We sat in my living room, surrounded by the remnants of my old life and the possibilities of whatever came next. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its nightly routine, full of families and couples and individuals all trying to figure out how to be happy. I wasn't happy yet, but I was something better. I was free. Free from the weight of other people's deceptions. Free from the burden of trying to save a marriage that one person had already abandoned. Free from the exhaustion of caring more about someone else's choices than they did. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Thank you for everything. Starting fresh in California." V. Victoria had found her new beginning 3,000 miles away from her old mistakes. Good for her. Another text, this one from Ross. "Love you, Dad. Proud of how you handled everything." And finally, one from Amelia. "Coming home next weekend. Want to hear all about your plans for world domination?" I smiled and put my phone away. The people who mattered were still in my life, and the people who'd chosen to leave were learning to live with their choices. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined 6 months ago, but it was the ending I'd earned. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. The next morning brought sunshine and the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. I was drinking coffee and reading the paper when my phone rang. Margaret Chen. "Jack, I wanted to thank you for bringing the situation at Waverly & Co. to my attention. Your information helped us avoid a much larger scandal." "I'm glad I could help, Margaret. I'm calling because I have a proposition for you. We're looking for a new facilities manager, someone to oversee maintenance and renovation projects for our various properties. The salary is excellent, and it would give you a chance to expand your business into commercial work." I thought about it for exactly 10 seconds. "When do I start? How about Monday?" "Monday works perfectly." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and laughed for the first time in months. Not because anything was particularly funny, but because sometimes life surprised you with opportunities that came disguised as disasters. Jake Turnbull was in prison, paying the price for his greed and arrogance. Marta was in a motel room, trying to figure out how to rebuild a life she'd destroyed through her own choices. Victoria was in California, running from her past and hoping for a better future. And I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking coffee and planning the next chapter of a story that was finally mine to write. Her boss had told me she chose better. I'd told him so did his investors. One phone call had ended Jake's career and started my new one. Sometimes the best revenge was simply refusing to be the victim of someone else's story. I finished my coffee, grabbed my keys, and headed out to start the first day of whatever came next. It was going to be a good day.